Well, hello and welcome to another Zoom session for 250 Real Ear. Today is April 15, and so it's Sunday, and it is not the normal day in which we do our Zoom session. However, I will not be here. Once again, I will not be here on Tuesday the 17th, as I will be presenting elsewhere once again. So I am doing this Zoom session for April 17 instead. So I'll be sending out everybody an email after this Zoom session and making an announcement and all that stuff. But basically, this is the Zoom session where we finish, or try to finish anyway, Unit 6. So we'll continue kind of from where we left off. And when would that have been? Probably, I think it was April 3rd. Okay, April 3rd on Tuesday, we launched into Unit 6, which is today's Real Ear. When we leave insertion gain and we move into in situ output, when we leave reading things in terms of REUR and REAR, and the difference between those two is real ear insertion gain, and did you hit your target, all of that stuff. That's yesterday's Real Ear. Today's Real Ear is called speech mapping, whereby we plot the audiogram on an SPLogram, and then we map speech accordingly. And some of this is what we talked about last week, and we will continue in this vein this week. So without any further ado, let's share screen and show you where we are here. If I pull up this guy here, you will see. I'll make it larger, and you will see basically what we've covered so far. In the course, non-electronic acoustic modifications, ANSI, hearing aid fitting methods yesterday, hearing aid fitting methods today, early Real Ear, today's Real Ear. So today we are on Unit 6 and continuing on in Unit 6. What do we have to do still? We still have to finish off software talks and Real Ear measurement walks. And that's kind of the finish of our course, really. And we'll spend a week or two looking at that, and that brings us to the end of the course, essentially. Okay? I like to keep ahead of things. It's more fun keeping ahead than trying to desperately keep up. And that's why we were able to actually take a week off this past week without too much punishment. But here goes. Let's look at today's Real Ear, and I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint for that. And we left off last week. I believe we talked about the differences between looking at things in terms of output versus looking at things in terms of gain. So today's Real Ear, this was yesterday's Real Ear. Remember this? Okay, Real Ear unaided response, Real Ear aided response. The difference between the two is Real Ear insertion gain, and did you hit your target? And that could be the target for the half gain method. It could be the target for the burger method, Pogo, Libby, Nal, any of those, all of that jazz, the old stuff. But this really is not a very good way to counsel a client as to the benefits of amplification. I mean, where's the audiogram on here? What can you see? I don't see anything there at all. I mean, there's really, I can say, well, the black line met the red line and they were pretty close. Oh, good. Did they get married? Whatever. But it doesn't tell me anything about audibility of speech. And Richard Seawald, the developer of the DSL, desired sensation level fitting method, saw that this was a terrible way to counsel. And he also said, Real Ear unaided response, I'll blow this up here, Real Ear unaided response is not even taken into consideration during the hearing test, because during the hearing test, you've plugged up the ear with a headphone. And remember, REUR is the resonance of your outer ear canal open, just like this cup. Here's a cup for you. Yeah, just for fun. Stop sharing here. I'll show you a new coffee cup I got. Big events. Hippy dippy, okay? Cool. Anyway, that's what you get for living out here on the West Coast, or as we call it, the wet coast. Okay, so stop sharing. Here we go, start sharing screen. So here we are, insertion gain. Not a very good counseling tool, but also Real Ear unaided response. The open ear canal is plugged when you're doing the hearing test. So if you're not using REUR during your hearing test, why in heaven's name are you using it in your hearing aid test. And that's the trouble with this situation. So we move on to an SPLogram. And that's where we take the hearing loss measured in dBHL and we add in normal hearing in dBSPL. Remember that? Minimal audible pressure. The softest it takes to just barely hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone in dBSPL, and you can see the variation in the decibels level. And remember, 2 weeks ago we said this black dotted line is 0 dBHL. That's why your audiometers are calibrated every year to make sure that actually these are the values. Look where my cursor is. These are the values at each particular frequency in dBSPL. Okay, and these values we plot as 0. So really this 0 line at 250 is actually 20 dBSPL, and 0 at 500 is actually about 15, and 0 at 1,000 is actually about 10, and so on. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, they've plot the audiogram now in dBSPL, so now hearing aids and hearing loss can read the same language, and then you have a wonderful tool for counseling, because I can show unaided speech, and I can see what areas are audible, and then you can see what you want to do with the hearing aids. Lift it up where it belongs. And then to get into today's real ear, we leave gain behind and we focus on output, okay? Because output is what's hitting your eardrum. So this is unaided outputs, and this is aided speech outputs, okay? So when you're leaving gain and you're going to output, I hate that black thing, go away there, good. Input plus gain is output. And you'll see red, yellow, green. Inputs, 3 different inputs at 1,000 hertz, plus gain equals output. And notice 90 dB input is generally given less gain and to equal an output of 95, whereas 50 dB input is given a lot more gain for 75 output. So this is not all things. I'm just giving you an example, but this is how outputs are read. The output for the softest input is the bottom one. The output for the average input is the middle one. The output for the loud input is the highest one. And there's 3 different outputs. These might be 3 different targets. Okay? Why? Because hearing aids are now compression. And compression gives different gain at different inputs, unlike linear hearing aids of yesterday, which gave the same gain for all inputs. Okay, so the user always had to turn his volume control, and the target gain over here, if I go back, the target over here, in this case, let's call it fitting method X. Okay, the target here was really intended for inputs of average speech, generally around half gain. Okay, you wanted average speech was your main signal of interest, because that's what most people are listening to with the hearing aids, is average input speech of 65 dBSPL or 55 dBHL. Well, okay, so the target was the single target offered by linear hearing aids was the target intended for average speech inputs, but they were plotted in gain. Now we're looking at outputs. And this yellow is the target output for, say, average inputs. Okay? And now you'll see the target output for soft inputs, target output for average, target output for loud inputs. And what's nice about output is that the top one is indeed the one for loudest inputs, and the bottom one is indeed the output you want for softest inputs. But when you start looking at gain situations, then you're looking at a totally different scene. So this is essentially a generic diagram of what all of today's fitting methods are trying to do, whether it's NAL 1, NAL 2, or DSL 5, who cares? Essentially, all of them are trying to map soft, average, and loud speech into the remaining dynamic range of the listener. You're mapping it. And notice the target output for soft speech is barely audible, and the target output for average inputs is about 1/3 above the hearing loss, and the target output for loud inputs is still below the asterisks, which is frequency-specific loudness discomfort levels. Thereby, you have mapped speech, today's real ear, and the SPLogram. Now, I'm not really sure why this is all in here, but to have a look at this slide, remember this slide? Okay, here we look at it. Let's figure this out to get to where we were last time. Look at your 3 green targets. Okay, one's a target for soft inputs, one's a target output for average inputs, and the top green line is the target output for loud inputs. And you'll see your 3 inputs here, 50, 70, and 90, color-coded, okay, to indicate what the hearing aid would be doing to match the targets. Well, look at 1,000 hertz. Okay, in this particular case, some audiogram got entered, your outputs are now plotted according to some fitting method, could be NAL, could be DSL, who cares, okay? But to look at gain, look what it says here in the white letters. To figure out what the gain was, you always have to subtract the input from the output. So let's look at 1,000 hertz. Let's look at the target output for 90 dB inputs. So let's look at the red, 90 dB inputs, and here's my target output, about 95. Well, what's the gain then? 5. 90 minus 95 minus 90 is 5. See, my output here is 95. My input was 90. My gain was 5. Let's look at the middle one. My target output at 1,000 hertz was about 85, something like that. 85, where I'm circling. Well, what was my input? 70. 85 minus 70 is 15. And look at the bottom one. My target output is about 75. My input was 50. 75 minus 50 is 25 gain. And that has a lot to do, I tied together that slide I'm just showing it you, kind of with this slide up here. Okay, look at that. Showing you that the gain goes down as the inputs go up. So really you want more than half gain for soft inputs, you want about half gain for average inputs, and you want less than half gain for loud inputs. Why? All because of this. Loudness growth and recruitment. 100 dB sounds just as loud to someone with hearing loss as it does to someone with normal hearing. Literally, your floor is elevated and your ceiling is not. And that's why you want about half gain for average inputs, more than half gain for soft inputs, less than half gain for loud inputs, because soft inputs should be amplified by a lot, average inputs should be amplified by less, loud inputs should be amplified by little or nothing at all. And then last time we also talked, well, you can see this slide too. I'll pull it up a little closer. This is all good review. Okay, just make sure we're all into it. We've had 2 weeks that we haven't seen each other. So here goes. If this is someone's hearing loss, around 50, a soft input around 5, you're going to amplify that by the full degree of the loss. And an average input that's barely audible to this guy, you might want to amplify by about half the degree of the loss. And a loud input, you don't want to amplify by much at all, because the UCL is down here around 105, 110. So essentially, this is your goal in terms of outputs. Linear gain gave the same gain at all inputs, 45-degree angle line, and then suddenly limited the maximum power output. Okay, and the little calculations on the left are talking to you about exactly that, so I leave those to you for your perusal. 0 input in this case was 50 output, so 50 dB gain. 20 in was 70 output, that's a 50 dB of gain. 40 in was 90 output, that's 50 dB of gain. Okay, you just follow the blue line. And then suddenly you're limiting the MPO. Well, WDRC, wide dynamic range compression. Okay, you had linear gain only for very soft inputs. So 0 in is 50 out in this case, 20 in is 70 out, 40 in is 90 out, and then you have your knee point and your low compression ratio. Whereas if I've increased my input by 20, from 40 to 60, my output only went from 90 to 100, okay, which is only 10. My input increased by 20, my output here, so when I went up to 60, my output's only at 100, okay, so my input went up by 20, and my output only increased by 10. That's a 20 to 10 ratio, or a 2 to 1 ratio. So note, linear gain is only for very soft inputs, it says here, up to about 40 dB SPL knee point. WDRC then occurs for average and louder inputs. As the inputs increase from 40 to 100, the outputs increase by only half as much. This is a compression ratio of 2 to 1, and this is how WDRC amplifies soft sounds by a lot and louder sounds by progressively less and less. And of course, the whole idea then, that's why fitting methods had more than one target. Okay, because now you're using RIC hearing aids. And most receiver in canal hearing aids don't even have a volume control. They're using WDRC. They're using compression, which is known as AGC, automatic gain control. You're getting different gains for different inputs instead of the same gain for all inputs. That's why newer fitting methods have three targets. One for soft inputs, one for average, one for loud, because you're getting different gains for different inputs, and therefore different outputs for different inputs. So newer fitting methods have 3 targets, the old ones had 1, because newer hearing aids are compression and older hearing aids were linear. So you're looking at all this stuff. This is all good to review. And then we finished last week or 2 weeks ago by looking at this slide here, gain versus output, shown for a simple instance. And notice gain decreases as inputs increase. Look at the left, WDRC. Most gain for soft inputs, less gain for average, less gain for loud. And so when you're plotting things in gain, the top one is for soft inputs, and the bottom one is for loud inputs. But when you're plotting things in output, it doesn't work that way. Then the top line is for loud inputs, and the bottom one's for soft inputs. And don't worry too much about wrapping your head around it, except to say just let the graph tell the story. Because if I have a 40 decibel input here, okay, my gain may have been 20, all right, at this frequency, right where my cursor is. All right, so if my input is 40 and my gain is 20, I guess my output is 60. Look where my cursor is. And look at the top one right here where my cursor is now. Okay, my gain is 30. Okay, 40 dB input plus 30 dB of gain equals a 70 dB output. See? Well, I just want you to realize the reversal when you're plotting things in gain versus output. And we said last week a more complicated case when you've got the same gain offered for the different input levels, okay? And when you're talking in terms of output, the lines look like this. Then don't freak, just let the graph talk to you, okay? Because when you're having a 40 decibel input, and your gain is looking like this yellow line, okay? This is just a fictitious target gain or a fictitious frequency response of a WDRC hearing aid. And maybe the guy's got no hearing in the no hearing loss in the low frequency, so you're not asking for much gain in the lows at all for any input. That's why the lines all join together, perhaps. So if this is the story you want for the gain, more treble gain for soft inputs, less treble gain for average, and less treble gain for loud inputs. Well, if you talk that story in terms of output, look at how different the lines look. You're telling the same story, but this one might have been in German and this one's in Polish. But the same story is being told. Look at the 40 line on the left. Okay? If my gain at this low frequency was 10 with a 40 input, well then with a 40 input, look at this. My output was 50, because 40 in plus 10 dB of gain is an output of 50. The red is output. And look at the peak at the 40 here, okay? And that's kind of a little bit of a misnomer, but if I'm looking at the peak at the 40 here, I'm getting 40 dB of gain, okay, for 40 dB inputs, well, then my output is 80. Okay? And again, don't freak about it. Just let the graph tell the story. When you're talking gain, things are read totally different than when you're talking output. We are now caught up. This was our review. Now we'll proceed ahead. All right, so probe tube measures today basically use NAL1 or NAL2 or DSL5. Manufacturers also have their own proprietary fitting methods, which tend to roll off high frequencies. Why do they do that? Probably to make the listener accept the hearing aid a little more. Really. A lot of manufacturers have their own proprietary fitting methods as well as NAL1 or NAL2 or DSL5. And in comparison to NAL1 or NAL2 or DSL5, the proprietary fitting methods really roll off the highs. I wouldn't use them. I would stay away from them. They're not giving enough high frequency gain or output. They really aren't. Software almost always overestimates the gain and output, almost always paints a rosier picture than what you really get. Real ear almost always shows less than what's predicted. Today's real ear measurement, we visualize aided speech, and we call it speech mapping. And it came out really with the DSL fitting method. They had a real rigid adherence to accuracy. Their motto was garbage in is garbage out. So they had a lot of these transforms that they used. Real ear to coupler difference? Well, a closed ear canal is smaller than a 2cc coupler. And so you've got to take that into account. Mic location effect. Okay, are you wearing a RIC hearing aid with the mic on top? Or are you wearing a CIC where the mic is buried inside your ear canal? And when the mic's buried inside your ear canal, you get the added resonance of the outer ear concha bowl. Whereas when the mic's on top of the ear, you don't get that. So the style of the hearing aid makes a difference. And on the SPLogram, the audiogram is displayed right side up, and in situ real ear aided response. In other words, in situ just means hearing aid in situation. Okay, so basically they're not looking at REUR and REAR and the difference being REIG. They're saying forget that, forget REUR and forget REIG. Just look at REAR. Only that one. That becomes the main focus. And plot everything in SPL. And then you can look at aided speech placed onto the dynamic range of the listener, much as we've shown so far. Basically, they change thresholds in dBHL to thresholds in dBSPL. The audiometer is calibrated for the average ear. Average adult real ear to coupler difference is used to change thresholds from dBHL into dBSPL. And basically, you'll see what I'm saying here, but have a look now. This is going to be a picture of typical real ear as it's done today. Minimal audible pressure on the bottom. Here's a hearing loss. So if you can think of this minimal audible pressure or 0 dBHL as a flat line, and then you see this curve above it that matches the shape of the curve at the bottom, you really then know that what they're plotting here is actually a flat 50 dB hearing loss, don't you? Because look at the distance between the threshold at 70 and the minimal audible pressure at 20. That's 50. Look at the threshold here at 500 versus the threshold here. And you take the difference, it's 50. Look at 1,000 hertz. Here's the threshold here, 60 minus about 10, 50. So the difference between the red line thresholds and minimal audible pressure at the bottom is 50. So basically, the hearing loss in dBHL must have been 50. Okay? So average minimal audible pressure is used for TDH39s. That's how they change dBHL thresholds into dBSPL thresholds. Real ear to coupler difference is what's used for insert headphones. Okay, this is how we find out. So mainly we are really mainly using average RECDs. But let's not worry too much about that now. But let's look at what real ear to coupler differences are. Make sure we memorize this from previous Zoom sessions. Okay, real ear to coupler difference. You are looking at the dashed line. And the dashed line might be a hearing aid frequency response in a 2cc coupler. And then the same hearing aid in a real ear might be the solid yellow curve. And notice what the difference is, because the real ear canal is smaller than a 2cc coupler, especially when it's plugged with a hearing aid. So because it's smaller, it's going to have more sound. Okay, just like a room full of mirrors has more light. So basically, if you're getting a frequency response in a 2cc coupler, if you want to find out what that's going to do in someone's real ear, you might as well add about 5 dB below 1,000 hertz. Look at the distance between the two lines here, and add about 10 dB above 1,000 hertz, and you'll get a basic idea of what the hearing aid will do in the person's real ear. In other words, if you had a hearing aid run on ANSI tests, let's say you had a hearing aid on a 2cc coupler and you saw frequency response. If you want to know what that's going to do in the guy's real ear, add about 5 dB below 1,000 hertz and add about 10 dB above 1,000 hertz. And you'll get a pretty close idea as to what it'll really do in the average adult ear canal, RECD. Real ear to coupler difference. Insert headphones are calibrated in a 2cc coupler, just like hearing aids are measured on a 2cc coupler. And basically, this has got way too many words on it, so it's kind of boring, really. But 2cc coupler values are constant, okay? But real ear to coupler differences, if you measured them, okay, they would all hover around this. They would all be similar to that, but they would all be just a little bit different. Okay, if you measured them. And this is basically how people measure it. Here's a 2cc coupler. And I'll tell you why I'm talking about RECD so much, okay? But in just a bit here. Here's a hearing aid on a 2cc coupler. You got 2 cubic centimeters of air. Okay? And here's a BTE measured on a 2cc coupler. And once again, that white square, 2 cc's of air. Well, remember, the closed ear canal is smaller. The real ear to coupler difference is done to change dBHL values with inserts into SPL values. So you're taking the audiogram and you're using RECD to change the dBHL audiogram into dBSPL audiogram. With circumoral headphones, you're using MAP, and with insert headphones, you're using real ear to coupler difference. That's why I'm talking to you about this. Either way, the SPLogram plots the thresholds in dBSPL. What I'm getting into here is a little bit of the nitty-gritty of how it's done, but freak not out too much. But I want to show you a picture of how they do RECD if you were to actually measure it. Here's a 2cc coupler, and here's the measurement tool stuck into the 2cc coupler. And then what you're going to do is take that same measurement tool, this is part of your real ear system, and you're going to be putting it on a sponge inside the guy's ear canal with a probe tube in, and you're going to measure what the difference is between this and this. Okay, and the ear canal that's closed is smaller. So you're going to find out the real ear to coupler difference. This might be an average RECD. You're measuring the coupler response of the insert headphone, measuring the real ear response of the same insert headphone. So the coupler insert headphone, okay, and the real ear insert headphone. And the difference is, okay, real ear to coupler difference. This dashed line would show the average RECD, and the yellow line is showing you the average measured RECD. When would you measure RECD? Really, the main time to measure RECD is if someone has a weird ear canal. Some little lady with a tiny, tiny, tiny little ear canal, or some guy with a great big honking ear canal, okay? When you get ear canals that don't look normal, then the real ear measurement systems advise you to measure the RECD. Otherwise, use the average, which is always an option on real ear equipment. You can always use averages or you can measure. And I'll show you what I mean here. I'll show you in a picture here, even when we go back up, and I'll give you an example here. Okay? Say you're looking here. Look at the asterisks. These are average uncomfortable loudness levels across the frequencies, okay, for specific frequencies, for this kind of a hearing loss. So you can choose the averages, or you can measure and plot your own. It's the same with RECD. You can either measure it or use the predicted averages. And that's the thing about today's real ear. There's lots of bells and whistles with it, but actually focus on the fact that they're trying to raise unaided speech and lay it in the guy's dynamic range, and memorize the fact that they take in real ear to coupler difference into account, mic location into account, and you can use predicted values that are inside the real ear equipment, or you can choose to measure. Okay? Anyway, and the topic I brought up to you today is that MAP is used to change average, what do you call it, thresholds in DBHL that were used with circumaural headphones to change those thresholds into DBSPL thresholds, and real ear to coupler difference is used to change thresholds by insert headphones measured in DBHL to change those thresholds into DBSPL. So one uses MAP, the other one uses real ear to coupler difference. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, enough on that. Okay, so we move along over here. Another neat reason why people used real ear to coupler difference, though, is when fitting children, babies. Because you could take the baby's real ear to coupler difference. Now check this out. You take the probe tube, stick it in the baby's ear, and then you take the little yellow sponge. So I'll share a screen again. I'm going to just show you a quick picture of it. Boom, boom, boom. Go on, we can go up. Okay, and you have the tube stuck in the baby's ear, and you put this thing in the ear, okay, and you measure the baby's real ear to coupler difference, just like they're showing you here. Okay, how do we measure RECD? How do we measure it? Okay, you have the probe tube in the infant's ear, and you have the insert headphone in the infant's ear. You know what the real ear, you know what the coupler response is, because that's always constant. And then you measure what's going on in the baby's ear when the baby's ear is occluded with a hearing aid or a small EAR plug. And then you've got the baby's RECD. Now, once you've got that, you can send baby home. Because, whoops, I went a little bit too far here. Once you have the baby's real ear to coupler difference, check this out. All right, once you have the baby's real ear to coupler difference, you can send baby home. Then you can plug the hearing aid onto the 2cc coupler, tune the hearing aid to whatever you want, factor in the RECD, and you will know exactly what's the hearing aid's going to do on the baby's ear. Wild, huh? Okay, and that's what's called SREM, simulated real ear measurement. You heard about it first here, okay? Maybe you didn't, but all right. So you can, when fitting kids, connect the hearing aid to a 2cc coupler, factor in the RECD. The ear canal grows each year up until about age 5. After this, the growth levels off. But then you can do SREM, simulated real ear measures. Adjust the hearing aid settings until you're hitting targets, and you factored in the RECD, you'll know exactly what the hearing aid's going to do in the kid's ear. I'll show you some examples of speech mapping with real ear, just for the fun of it here, okay? So here you've got MAP at the bottom, normal hearing in 0 dBHL. And then you have some hearing loss plotted in dBSPL. And then you have loudness discomfort levels across the top. And that's the guy's dynamic range, the decibel distance between his floor of hearing and his ceiling of loudness tolerance. And you have the plus signs in the center. Those would be maybe an output target for average inputs. Now you can see that these are kind of in the middle of the dynamic range. That's a bit high. When we remember I showed you earlier you wanted the output targets for average inputs to be about a third above the thresholds, not really halfway above. So in a weird way, this is kind of like probably not NAL 2, not NAL 1, not DSL 5. It's probably DSL 4, which, as we all recall, was a high-power, hungry hearing aid fitting method, no longer used. At any rate, just for the fun of it, look at the pictures. Because now here's the hearing aid hitting target, pretty close. And then you'll see these weird vertical lines. Now those weird vertical lines, you don't see that anymore. This is off of an old real ear system called the AudioScan, and it was called the RM500, an ancient machine. I mean, we're talking old. If I show you, I think I'll bet you any money I've got a picture of this puppy way up front. Yep, right here. Look at this. It's off of this instrument here, a little black suitcase-like thing, and it had DSL-4 on it. I just wanted to show it to you just for fun, but we'll go back to our picture here and move on down. Okay, so now you are here. And notice, okay, what that machine did was first it had average inputs, and then you'd match your targets for average speech inputs, and then you'd have soft sounds coming out like bleep, bloop, bloop, bleep, and it was meant to imitate the stops and starts of speech. Bleep, 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 bleep. They didn't have actual speech. It was just sounds that went stops and starts to imitate the staccato stops and starts of speech. And then what you would want is for some of the lines to hang around the thresholds. That meant you were making soft input speech barely audible. And then you'd have loud, and you would hope that the tops of the bars would never exceed loudness discomfort levels. Now you can see that they are. Okay, so there's a little bit too much happening here. But in all essence, once again, you're doing 3 measurements. One for average inputs, one for soft, and one for loud. And that's a lot of what we do in today's real ear. Now here's another case showing you the very same thing. Okay, here's the hearing loss measured in dBHL on the left. Here's the same hearing loss now in dBSPL on the right. And here's the asterisks are the loudness discomfort levels. And then you can see the plus signs are the targets. So you're hitting the targets with the hearing aid, and the plus signs are looking at the target for average speech inputs. And then you had your soft inputs. You can see the bars kind of hanging around the thresholds. And then the outputs for loud inputs, okay, are started. You want those to stay below the asterisks. And then you've done a pretty good job in terms of hearing aid fitting. You've got 3 different inputs: soft, average, and loud. Now this is ancient real ear. I mean, this is an old, look at the dates on here. 2006. This is a picture actually out of the 2nd edition of my book, Compression for Clinicians. The newest edition was 2017. So this is like 11 years ago. But it's already newer real ear was coming into the picture then. Okay, and so it was beginning to be used. And so you're learning really here how we got from yesterday to where we are today. On newer real ear measurement equipment, like, don't worry about VeriFit because that's barely made anymore. Basically, you've got speech or pink noise meant to imitate the spectrum of speech. And it's going to be the average inputs of 65 dBSPL. You try to meet your targets, and that would be shown by the plus signs or what have you, and those are usually about a third above your thresholds. And then secondly, you try soft inputs around 55 dB SPL, and you hope that your outputs hang around the thresholds. In other words, they're barely above the thresholds, because normal hearing people can barely hear soft speech. So why should hearing aided people be any different? Okay, and then you have your third stimulus, which is your MPO, your maximum power output stimulus, and that may or may not be speech. It could be speech, or it could be do 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 do. Anyway, you want the outputs to stay below loudness discomfort levels, and then essentially you have mapped speech. Okay, you want to fill up the guy's dynamic range. You want to spread unaided speech at 3 different levels, and you want to make that all visible on the person's dynamic range. So that's why, in a weird way, I'm going to go back to this slide and really highlight its importance, because it's a very, very important slide, I believe. And that is going to be, I think it's this one. No, hang on, I'm looking. Hang on, I'll find that puppy. It's the most important slide of the entire presentation, in my opinion. Of course, when I'm trying to find that one, that's when you can never find it, of course. You know how that goes. But here, this one. This is the most important slide of this entire PowerPoint, right here. This is what you're trying to do with any fitting method. Whether it's NAL 1, NAL 2, DSL 5, this is meant to be a generic, average, desired. This is what you want when you're speech mapping. You want your outputs for soft inputs to hug thresholds. You want your outputs for average inputs to be about 1/3 above the thresholds. You want your outputs for loud inputs to be below loudness discomfort levels. In all essence, that's what you're trying desperately to do with Real Ear today. So we've covered lots of stuff. I know we're all over the map, but don't freak, okay? Just hang in there. So, all right, these would be on newer Real Ear. You've got your average, soft, and loud inputs. And let's look now at some. This is not the Oracle that's at OTC, but this is on AudioScan. It could be on the Axiom, could be on God knows what. All Real Ear systems are created fairly equal. They all do similar things. Just like all cars have a gas pedal, a brake, and a steering wheel, all same thing with Real Ear. They're all just a little bit different from each other, but here you go. Look at the picture. The bottom curve, minimal audible pressure, or 0 dB HL. The blue is the guy's left ear thresholds. The asterisks are loudness discomfort levels. The fitting method here was NAL 1. Look at the targets. They're about 1/3 above the thresholds. And then in the highs, they meet the thresholds. See? It's just all to get a picture of it. The SPLogram, once again, unaided speech, long-term average speech spectrum, LTAS, another long-winded acronym for long-term average speech spectrum. In other words, AKA, also known as unaided speech. Normal hearing, 0 dBHL on the bottom, MAP. Loudness tolerance levels, frequency specific, asterisks at the top. Rising audiogram, in other words, poorer and poorer hearing toward the high frequencies. You now know exactly what the person hears, what's above his thresholds and what's below his thresholds. And what's really interesting about LTAS is that its mean, the average, isn't in the center of the range. Speech has about a 30 decibel dynamic range. In other words, speech is softer and louder. It's bouncing all over the place. And the waveform, if you took a look at the wave of speech, the actual sound waves of speech, the peaks to valleys would be about 30 dB wide. Okay, so that's why they draw the spectrum. Okay, that's why they always show the spectrum of speech as having about a 30 decibel wide spread. And if you look here, you'll see that's about 30 dB wide. And what's interesting is that the mean is not quite in the center. it's a little bit toward the top. It's about 12 dB below the top and about 18 dB above the bottom. And let's kind of make it our business to know why that is. And that's what this picture's showing you too. About 12 dB above the top and about 18 dB above the bottom. Kind of interesting, kind of weird, okay? That's because speech fluctuates in intensity over time, and noise does not. So let's get rid of that black bar there. Thank you. Look at it. It's called amplitude modulation. Modulation means the fluctuation in the amplitude envelope. Here's the envelope, the top, where my cursor is, and the bottom. So if you're talking about a fan or an air conditioner, the sound of my laptop in front of me, I can hear it. But the sound of my flapping gums to you over this Zoom session is like the bottom. Okay, so speech is weird. I mean, W-E-I-R-D, odd. Dogs and cats must be laughing their heads off at us, okay? Because they're just barking and meowing. We're flapping our gums like mad, standing up on two legs. So speech as an acoustic stimulus is bizarre compared to noise. And it has a lot of amplitude modulation, whereas noise does not. And if you take a look at a statistical distribution, okay, of noise compared to speech, and if you look at noise as being the green, okay, most of its intensity is at some specific dBSPL. Look at the axes here. The horizontal is decibels, from soft on the left to loud at the right. And then the vertical is the percent of times that the noise is at any one particular intensity. And with most background noise, it'll be at some noise intensity, look at my dotted line, most of the time. Okay? And I always give the example of, think of a teacher in a 6th grade class. Some kids, look at the markings here. Some kids got D's, some got C's, some got B's, some got A's. And how many, the vertical axis, how many students got A's? Oh, just a few. Look at my cursor. How many students got B's? Oh, lots. How many got C's? Oh, quite a few. How many got D's? Not very many. That's a bell curve. That means a normal distribution of grades in the classroom. Well, that's the same thing with noise. Noise is mostly flat. In other words, the amplitude doesn't modulate much over time, and so the amplitude of noise is steady at one particular intensity most of the time, unlike speech. And if you looked at the statistical distribution of speech intensity, well, then you might as well look at the orange, because it's all over the place. It's nuts. So the mean, which is the average, is not equal to the middle number, which is not equal to the number that occurs the most often. That's what those words mean, mean, median, mode, okay? And when you don't have those things all being equal, you've got a bizarre distribution of intensity. And that, by the way, BTW, is how digital hearing aids sample whether the incoming sound is noise or whether the incoming sound is speech. Does it fluctuate like crazy in amplitude over time? It must be speech. Amplify the crap out of it. Is the amplitude staying pretty steady over time? It's probably noise. Reduce the gain. Okay, you learned about that a bit in 240, and here it is again. Okay, hearing aids use amplitude modulation to determine if the sound is speech or whether it's noise. And they're using math to look at the statistical distributions to figure out whether it's this on the bottom or this. But to make a long story short, the reason why the mean is not in the middle with speech is precisely because of this nonsense here. That's why the average LTAS isn't in the center of its range. That's why you always see it looking like this on real ear equipment. Just thought I'd fill you in case you want to know. And again, here's the long-term average speech spectrum. The mean ain't in the center of the range. Why not? Because speech is staccato, because its intensity changes rapidly over time. So let's finish this Zoom session. What speech sounds would be audible here, and which are not? And hopefully you'll say, just the vowels are audible. Only those are above the guy's thresholds. So here's DSL child versus DSL adult versus now 1. And here's DSL 5 for an adult. Look at the targets. Okay. And look at unaided speech, laying down that big green area here. And what you want to do is make that mean, the line I'm tracing with my cursor, you want that touching the plus signs. Here's now 1, same hearing loss. Look at the red line didn't change at all, okay? The thresholds are the same. Now versus DSL. Now 1 versus DSL. I don't know where this hatch mark went. It just isn't there. It should be, but it isn't. Anyway, so again, unaided speech below, but you'd want that solid line where my cursor is to touch these plus signs. And notice that these plus signs are about 1/3 above the threshold. Note that now 1 asks for less in the very highs than DSL does. But now 1 looks at more mids than DSL does. That's one of the ways you can recognize a now 1 from DSL 5. And look at now 2. Now 2 also backs off on the highs, just like now 1. But you remember how now 1 thresholds ended in thin air? Now 2, they don't. You can see this one here. Okay, but another thing that distinguishes now 2 from now 1 is now 2 asks for less in the mids. Now 1 is doing this, and now 2 is doing that. So here now 2, now 1, DSL 5. Now 1, now 2. Weird, huh? So let's compare DSL 5 to now 2. Here's DSL 5 targets for average inputs and DSL 5 targets for soft inputs, the pink or purple. And now let's look at now 2. Targets for average inputs being green, targets for soft inputs being pink or purple. DSL 5, now 2. DSL 5, now 2. Can you see how close they are? In a weird way, fitting methods have become closer and closer and closer together. What they're trying mainly to do is to achieve that central slide that I was showing you. Amplify soft sounds so they're barely audible. Amplify average sounds so they're about 1/3 above the thresholds. And amplify loud sounds so the output stays below the asterisks. And I think that's where I'm going to finish here. I think we've talked enough. Next week, we'll finish this unit, okay, and begin maybe on Unit 7, but we'll really try to clean house and fix things up in Unit 6, but we've had a 2-week hiatus, and so that's why I spent a lot of time in reviewing here. I think it's important that we talk about a bit about the stuff that we did 2 weeks ago, too, to refresh our minds. And we talked a bit about RECD, because some real ear systems use RECD to change dB-HL thresholds into dB-SPL thresholds, and the same units will use MAP to change circumoral thresholds in dB-HL to dB-SPL. But don't worry about that so much. That's all just the inner workings inside the machine. The main thing is the thresholds get transferred to dB-SPL. And now hearing aids and hearing loss are talking in the same language. And you're no longer sitting there saying insertion gain at the bottom, and did my insertion gain hit my target? Now you can literally see with your own eyes unaided versus aided speech, and you can literally map soft, average, and loud inputs. so you can see the outputs plainly laying in the listener's dynamic range. Okay, D would be for done. Stop sharing, Ted. I can be quiet now. I will hit the stop record button and I'll upload this as a Zoom section and put it up on 250 Unit 6. Adios, amigos. Live long and prosper. All right. Stop recording.